You're listening to the Max Planck Lawcast, which showcases the academic research currently being conducted across the Max Planck Law Network. I'm your host, Christopher Murphy, and together we'll be talking to some of the more than 400 researchers who are pushing the frontiers of legal knowledge in Germany and abroad. When it comes to new and exciting legal research, the Lawcast has you covered. Well, welcome back to the Lawcast. On today's episode, we're going to be talking about colonial law and colonization in South Africa and Zambia. More specifically, we'll broach the issue of colonial education in these two countries, assessing for whom, and just as importantly, by whom, education was provided during English colonial rule. The decolonization of education will also be discussed. To do all this, I'm joined in the studio by Alicia Haripershad. Originally from South Africa, Alicia is a doctoral researcher at the Max Planck Institute for Legal History and Legal Theory here in Frankfurt. Welcome to the program, Alicia.
Thank you. I'm very happy to be here.
Yeah, wonderful to have you on the show today. Before we kind of start looking and talking about education in colonial South Africa and Zambia, maybe you could give us a brief rundown of the timelines involved and the countries involved.
Yes, sure. When it comes to South Africa, the colonial history is quite torn between the Dutch and the British. The reason for this is because there was quite a focus on the Cape as a refreshment post, given the motivation from the Dutch and from the British with their trade in Asia. Mm-hmm. And so the Cape was kind of a perfect place to have a break. And this was what initially sparked an interest in the Cape and in South Africa as a whole.
Okay, right.
Exactly.
To fill up on fresh fruit, water, food, everything like that.
Exactly. And as they realized that actually there was more that the Cape had to offer, this is when expansion kind of went inward and more was kind of, quote, discovered, unquote, about the Cape. But for the purposes of my research, I'll only be focusing on the British part of the colonial rule because my time period is from 1880 to 1930. And in the case of Zambia, Zambia was only ever under British colonial rule, but in terms of how this looked administratively, it was a bit different, and this changed. Initially, it was from the British South Africa Company, and when the company was no longer profitable in Zambia, then it was administered by the Crown as a colony.
Now we have rundown timelines, countries involved during the colonial period there in South Africa and Zambia. The focus of your dissertation, though, is on the provision of education in these two countries during this colonial period. Who were the key actors then involved in the establishment of the colonial education system?
Yes, so when I started to look into my thesis in the beginning, something that really struck me about education was the fact that it kind of started even before the colonial state was in place. And so this really sparked my interest in trying to understand, okay, so if the colonial state wasn't doing it, who actually started providing education for indigenous groups who were there? And this is when I came across, quite the influential role that missionaries played. And so through this, of course, you would see involvement from the church, you would see involvement from missionaries. In terms of missionary, what I mean for the purposes of my research is Protestant missionaries, as there were more Protestant missionaries in South Africa and in Zambia in my period of focus.
And why were there more Protestant missionaries there?
I can imagine it was probably from the influence of Dutch settlers and German settlers from before, bringing more of a Protestant view given what was happening in Europe at the time of them resettling to the colonies. Yep. Okay.
Before we continue on talking a little bit about the missionaries themselves, just a quick question about what age are we talking about in the education system there? Are we talking about primary school education? Or, I mean, obviously that term didn't exist, primary school, secondary school at the time, but what age range are we?
So in terms of the indigenous groups in this time period, what we understand today as primary education was what was actually only available. Okay. So the possibility of really going on to have high school and having further education in university was not really an option. Of course, there were people who managed to do it, but it was not something that was accessible to everyone.
Okay.
During the time.
There's a fairly basic education, reading, writing, arithmetic.
Exactly. Okay. Very basic.
Mm-hmm. You touched on it briefly before. We know why the missionaries were prevalent there, but why were they then so involved in setting up these schools?
So from what I understand from the literature I've seen, there was quite an emphasis on literacy because in terms of this focus of spreading religion, of spreading Christianity, literacy was very important in order to be able to teach the Bible. And so this was really like the birth of education to the extent that it would help with literacy, could help with conversion, could help with reading and understanding the Bible. And so this was really the start, and it was only with time that it evolved and other skills were starting to be learned and starting to be taught.
Okay. Under whose authority did the missionaries then set up these schools or act themselves? I'm gathering that, okay, as you say, at the beginning there was no state involvement in the provision of education, but this changed with time. Was there a back and forth, a to and fro between the missionaries and the state, or a power shift concerning education?
Yeah, this is a great question. And I think this really goes to kind of the core of what my research will try to do. I think in terms of critically evaluating the extent to which these missionaries were in fact authorized. And I would say with my research so far, I'm kind of approaching it in different layers of authority. So looking at the initial authorization for missionaries to even be able to go to the colonies, this in fact goes all the way back to the Berlin Conference, where the different European powers decided to kind of divide Africa into the different colonies. And in this treaty that they discussed in the conference, there is in fact provision giving missionaries kind of special protection under the guise of freedom of religion and allowing them already on this international law level to be able to go to the colonies. So we can see here they already have a very special protected position. Then the next level of authority we can see would come from missionary societies. So this would be kind of the head office of the society in the different metropoles. So for example, with the London Missionary Society coming from London itself. And this type of authority is something I'll be analyzing more during my research and trying to understand, were the missionaries in the colonies agents from the societies at the metropole? Were they acting as trustees in what they believed to be the best interest of these indigenous groups? So yeah, this really opens up a lot of questions. And the final aspect would be the extent to which the missionaries were empowered by the colonial state once the colonial state was more set up. And once the colonial state kind of realized, okay, we need to get in this game of education. So you've already set something up. Are we endorsing what you're doing? Are we changing what you're doing?
Okay, sure. So different layers there.
Yes.
That maybe leads to a good segue to my next question. So we have different missionary societies there acting under different authorities or different levels of authority. I know you're not too far along in your research yet, but have you been able to find out whether this contributed to different types of educational systems across the countries or in certain regions of the two countries?
So what's interesting about the missionary societies is that this was not necessarily reflecting or limited to the nationality of the colonial power. So by this, I mean, just because South Africa and Zambia were under British colonial rule doesn't mean they were only British missionary societies. So this is really interesting in terms of considering the kind of ideals and values that they would bring with them in terms of the conversion process and also in terms of then the education they would be providing. What this also meant was when it came to setting up the missionary stations and focusing on conversion, there were also points of tension and conflict where the societies were in fact scrambling for space and dominion in order to try really establish a basis.
Okay, so they were also colonizing within a colony, so to say, their religious footholds.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, okay. Question I have there is, what about the language? Did German missionaries then teach in German, Dutch missionaries in Dutch, English missionaries in English? How did that work?
So there were different approaches. I would say in general, it seemed to be a lot of times that, for example, with the English missionary societies, they would try maybe focus more on English, but there would be different perspectives. Surprisingly, a lot of times, a good amount of engagement with local languages as well, where they would actually try, and I think they found that this was easier for conversion to also try and, change the Bible to a local language and have this also as an easier way to have conversion.
Right, okay. Don't go away, because we're going to have plenty more for you after this short break.
Max Planck Law is a network of 10 Max Planck Institutes engaging in legal research. The first of these was established in Berlin in 1924. Today, we cover a broad range of legal studies, from the anthropology of law to tax law. We operate one of the world's largest programs for doctoral and postdoctoral research in law. Visit our website today at law.mpg.de.
Welcome back to the Lawcast. Thanks for listening to us today. What about the educational frameworks and the curriculum, so to say, that was being taught?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. I think this is something I'll also plan to look into. And I think the evolvement of the curriculum is quite an interesting one because there's also, I think, quite a few different layers to it. As I mentioned, when the curriculum kind of first started, there was this focus on literacy. Later, we see when the colonial state gets more involved, particularly with certain areas where maybe there's quite a high value on indigenous labor, there would be more of industrial training, more of agricultural training. And so we really sometimes see this reflective of the colonial motives of what would be useful for people to actually learn.
What about questions of morals, race, the mission to civilize? Do these also play a role?
Yes, absolutely. So this mission to civilize is quite an interesting one. I think particularly looking at it from a British missionary point of view, we see this idea of kind of feeling like the missionaries would want to educate local populations with the intention of civilizing them. And by civilizing, through this idea of kind of importing their ideals and their morals of what is good and trying to make these indigenous groups mirror that in a way in order to be saved and in order to feel that they can integrate into society. In terms of gender and sexuality, this is also a very interesting one from what I've seen so far, particularly because a lot of the missionaries were men. We see this idea, like a lot of heteronormative values in terms of we should have all the boys together, all the girls together, the boys having a different curriculum to what the girls have, the girls kind of being more in a stream of what it would mean to be a good housewife. So learning more sewing, learning cooking, more of this. Whereas the men, because they would be going into the workforce, going into a colonial idea of a workforce for an indigenous person at the time, more, as I mentioned, the agriculture, more of the industrial training.
Okay, very interesting. Wow. That kind of gets me then to a question about, you've obviously got a great wealth of knowledge here on the subject matter. How have you gone about obtaining information on colonial education in South Africa and Zambia? Does it mean going to a lot of first-hand sources, or is there more recent literature that's brought a lot of this together?
So luckily for me, there's a lot of really great literature. So as a starting point, before I was able to go to the archives, I think this allowed me to get a really good picture of what the scene was. But a lot of this is really more from only a historical perspective and sometimes an anthropological perspective, but not necessarily looking at the law aspect. Okay. And I think this is how I realized, okay, I think this could be my gap. Yeah, I can jump in here and kind of take this analysis in a more legal direction. So I've been lucky enough to do some archive trips. Last year, I went to South Africa for 3 weeks and I visited the National Archives in Pretoria, as well as the Western Cape Archives in Cape Town. And earlier on this year, I also went to London and I went to the National Archives there, as well as the Special Archives at the School for Oriental and African Studies at the University of London.
Okay, wow. And that's all then looking kind of at first-hand sources from the time then?
Exactly. So these have all been primary sources. It's been different, perhaps like letters between the offices. It's also been government gazettes. It's been legislation. It's been a lot of conferences, so meeting minutes, resolutions. It's really been like quite a range.
Oh, wow. Okay. Yep. And is the kind of the source material you're finding at these different archives different depending on whether we're in South Africa or in London, for instance?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think the first observation I would say is there's quite a big difference between the colonial archives and the missionary archives. So particularly with the two in South Africa and the National Archives in London, these were the more colonial archives. So you can really see everything's framed from a more state perspective. Whereas the archives at SOAS were missionary archives. So this was the first time I saw something like this. And it was extremely interesting because the perspective is very different.
Yeah, sure.
Particularly seeing some of the missionaries in the colony writing back to the metropole, explaining certain situations, almost doing a kind of audit of the mission stations. So that was very fascinating.
Okay, yeah. We talked before about language. What about the archival material, especially from the time? Because it's obviously partly in English, but there'll be other languages, I'm guessing as well, Dutch, German, I'm not sure, French, or the local indigenous languages. Are there translations of this, or do you have to then kind of leave that out of your research, or do you speak all these languages?
I wish I could speak all all of those languages. So yes, I think in the case of South Africa, there are documents in English and Afrikaans and Dutch. So I have tried a bit with the Afrikaans and the Dutch, but I think I will for sure have to have this as a limitation. I will actually go to Zambia at the end of this week, in fact, for 2 weeks. So I'll let you know later about the languages of that. But I would actually like to make another comment about the language. Something I didn't anticipate before going into it was I think I kind of went with my 2023 brain into the archives. So when it came to searching documents, the search terms I would use would really be with my current language. And I found very quickly that this was not bringing up a lot of results. Right. And I had to try, albeit very difficultly, put myself in the perspective of, okay, in 1880, what were people speaking about in this way? What would be an appropriate search term? And kind of this allowed me to kind of open up to access a lot more things.
Oh, okay. Have you got an example maybe you could provide there?
For example, now I'm speaking about indigenous groups, but of course, then they were not really calling it indigenous groups. It was more like native or, obviously some other words that I would prefer not to say.
No, sure. Okay.
But I think that also maybe touches on something else of sometimes how difficult it can be to also read archive documents, because I think we all know you're going into this colonial archive. It's quite loaded with racism, with this very heavy history, and having to kind of put yourself in that perspective and, deeply read these sources can be quite a lot.
Okay, wow, I well understand. Are the sources digitalized, or are you kind of then a digital database and then you go and look at the paper?
Yes, so it's a digital database and you can kind of preview if something would be useful with just some limited sentences. Sometimes they give you a small summary about it, or sometimes you just have to judge based on the title. And then you would order the document and then you access the physical document.
With white gloves?
You can wear white gloves. Some people also wear masks because it's very dusty. Yes. Yeah. And there's a lot of protective gear. So, for example, you have to put things on a kind of a foam cushion.
Yes.
So it's not like a lot of the books are very old, so it's not going to break.
Oh, right. Okay. That's quite interesting to hear the story behind kind of researching in these older archives, with material from hundreds of years ago. So, all right. I know you, as I said before, you're kind of at the beginning, although you've obviously done a lot of kind of archival research. And I was wondering maybe if you could share something with us that you've already seen from the archives that you've visited.
Yes. So one of the ideas I think I can share so far is how the identity of the missionaries influenced the education system in terms of the filtering down of these gender norms that we spoke about. So I think this is something I've realized, particularly in just opening up a bit and reading some sources from the 1940s, when there's a shift globally in realizing the importance of educating girls and women, and then retrospectively looking back and realizing that, okay, they focused way too much on educating boys, and the way in which they were educating girls was a very limited scope, perhaps because of these values that they were bringing into starting the education system.
Sure. Okay. Yeah. I wonder if that was only in the colonies of South Africa at the time, or would that also be run parallel in the countries where the missionaries, for instance, came? I guess they brought also somewhat their ideas, as you say, with them.
No, that's an excellent observation. And I think it absolutely is a mirror to an extent, because I think a lot of times, even with education coming more to prominence in the colonies, this only really happens when it comes more to prominence in Britain, because of course it would be amazing if it was way ahead. Yeah. But unfortunately, it was really mirroring to an extent. And I think as these discussions were happening in the metropole, in London, in Britain, this was kind of then also filtering down.
Okay, right. We promised before the listeners that we'd also talk briefly about the decolonization of education. What does this concept entail?
For me, decolonization in general is a process, I think, of like undoing these colonial practices and kind of rethinking the function and the impact of something. So in the case of decolonizing education, it would be kind of, rethinking the function and impact of the education, of the law behind the education, and I think being more critical of it to see the extent to which it can change and should change.
And the decolonization of education is something that's obviously ongoing. What do you feel that your research will be able to add to this debate?
I hope that my research could add a different perspective to the debate in terms of perhaps not just focusing so much on the colonial powers, but also just thinking more broadly about different actors who contribute to education in general. So, of course, in my case, it's the missionaries, but I think it could very well be a lot of other actors in different places. And I think it's important to just maybe broaden it and not limit it to being so state-focused.
Okay. Wonderful. Alicia, unfortunately, that's all we have time for today, but thank you so much. I really enjoyed the conversation, and all the very best for your PhD research.
Thank you very much. I really enjoyed it too. Thank you for having me.
You're welcome. Thanks for listening to the Lawcast. If you'd like more information about Max Planck Law, or if you'd like to get involved, please visit us at law.mpg.de.
Max Planck Law. Excellence in legal research.